Hi, my name's Chris Nichols, and today I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the history of Deep Creek. So, Deep Creek Lake has been such a fixture in Garrett County for so long, it's tough to really think about the time when it wasn't there. But it used to be that there was just Deep Creek flowing through the central part of the county until 1925 when it was dammed to create Deep Creek Lake. So we're going to look today at life in the glades before the dam. So the glades is what a lot of the authors and sources refer to the area, generally more of the northern part of the lake, kind of around between Accident and Thayerville, bounded by the Youghiogheny on the west and probably Meadow Mountain, maybe even Savage River on the east. But we've got, some sources that tell us what life was like back then, but we're not really sure who named Deep Creek and when that was, kind of the first naming of that was. The first mention that I've seen is from the McHenry family letters dated from 1818, so we'll take that as the first time it was written down as Deep Creek. And how we know what we know, that I'll be going through this presentation, are some really great written sources from the early 1800s. So as I mentioned, the McHenry family letters, a report from James Shriver on surveying the C&O Canal. We have a book called Reminiscence of an Old Sportsman. Meshick Browning's book, of course, from the kind of middle 1800s. We've got some maps. We've got some sources about Lake Brown and Cleveland Lake, which we'll talk about. And we've got newspaper searches, mainly from the late 1800s onwards, that helps us fill in some of these gaps. Just in general about this area, Deep Creek was indeed deep. It was about 3 to 4 feet deep, which is kind of unusual for typical streams in the area. I think a lot of times you'll see streams in this area of maybe a foot deep, maybe kind of wider and flowing through forested and rocky areas. But for most of its course, Deep Creek, from its southern origin out near what is today Sand Flat Road to generally about where the 219 bridge is today, the banks were very grassy, kind of marshy and swampy in that area. And then as you pass that area of the 219 bridge, the course of Deep Creek became more rocky. You had a lot of mountain laurel and rhododendrons, kind of that thick coverage in those rocky river and stream valleys that you see often around here. And it's kind of like that until it met the Youghiogheny River. But the area of the main body of the lake was subject to getting flooded when there was heavy rains or big snow melts. So a couple of authors noted that marshy, swampy area would kind of fill up into its own little lake intermittently when it was rainy or very damp out. But even before all of the big dam, the 1925 dam, it was already a sportsman's paradise. The combination of the Deep Creek and the grassy area really created some great habitat for things that people like to hunt and fish for. So trout and waterfowl and other bigger game were all in a lot of abundance, especially in the early 1800s, as we'll see from some of our source documents. But really, there was not a lot of permanent settlement in the area, and it seems to have had a peak of interest and settlement in the early to mid 1800s, kind of trailed off a bit until the dam was built. So we'll see some indications of how the interest in the area kind of ebbed and flowed over time as well. Just to give you a general orientation of what we're looking at pre-lake, this is a 1901 topographical map, so all of the land and water features are what they would have been early 1800s and before, with the exception of that little state dam that's right here about where the Glendale Bridge is today. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but just to give you the orientation here, kind of cut off the origin of Deep Creek, but it starts down here where Sand Flat Road would be down here and flows through the southern part. And right here you can see the indication on this map that this was that marshy area that was kind of subject to inundation, and then continues its course through here. And you can see even on the map that it gets into more of a canyon type of situation where you expect those rocky, real thick coverage to exist. And we've got some of the roads that have we'll talk about and have somewhat persisted for today, but there was, by the early 1800s, there was kind of one main crossing point for Deep Creek right around here. That was the main artery of the county, north to south, or one of the, probably the main one to go to the northwestern part of the county. And you can see some of the other features that existed back then. Let's jump right into our first source of information about Deep Creek, and that was from Colonel James McHenry. He was a physician, aide to General Washington during the Revolutionary War, Secretary of War under two administrations, and the namesake for both the town of McHenry and the Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And after he was not a healthy person, and he retired from public life after his service as Secretary of War, and had a summer place up here. He acquired land around 1800, eventually owned over several thousand acres, including tracts known as Locust Tree Bottom, Buffalo Marsh, Wild Cherry Tree Meadows, and some others. A real quick interesting story about Buffalo Marsh is, that the area right around where McHenry, the town, is today. And that was so named because the very early explorers of the area found a buffalo carcass, a dead buffalo, stuck in that marsh. And evidence that there were buffalo on the East Coast, but they got very quickly kind of driven out and driven to the west. But an interesting little side story on the name of Buffalo Marsh. So Colonel McHenry was a fairly prolific letter writer, and his nephew John McHenry, a lawyer, somewhat inherited the homestead there, and he lived at the Glades, as the general area was called, and he continued to improve and build up the site until he died in 1856. And he also wrote some letters that are good sources. So just to orient you, the Lake Point Inn, if you're familiar with that today, is likely generally around where the McHenry's log house was. And throughout this, I've got the footnotes from where each of the sources are down at the bottom, and at the end of the presentation, I'll have a list of all of these references, and you can always visit my website, dimesy.com, where an electronic version of this with active links will be available, so you can click on all these and dig into your heart's content. I have a lot of quotes throughout this presentation. I won't read every single one of them, but this one is fantastic, and it should be on the cover of every vacation visitor guide to the county. So this is Dr. McHenry writing to a friend of his, the Honorable Thomas Johnson, and he says, "I feel like this country, its salubrious air, its mild summers, its interesting views made up of hills, woods, glades, streams, and mountains. Above all, it delights me as affording me, at my time of life, a salutary retirement from the busy world and its cares. I do not feel therefore dispossessed to wander further, or to quit it in a hurry. Indeed, did it quadrate with the interest of the whole of my family to fix here, I should never move from the spot I am now." And at Cherry Tree Meadows in 1812. So what a fantastic summary of what makes this area so great. He appreciated what the special things about the Glades and Garrett County and the Deep Creek area. Several of these letters discuss the fishing opportunities. So the letters from John McHenry discuss how good Deep Creek was for trout fishing. And then in the next excerpt of the letters, he discusses again some of the great features of this country and the territory, and how beautiful it is and how good the people are. So some very nice little snippets about the area in 1818. Moving on to our next source, this is a report by a James Shriver, and he was an engineer with the C&O Canal Company. So at this point, he wrote in 1824, he was commissioned to write a report on extending the C&O Canal past Cumberland to eventually connect with the Ohio River. So Chesapeake in Ohio, and never lived up to its full name. And the goal of that would have been so that you could create a fully circular trade route, starting in the Chesapeake Bay, going all the way to the Ohio River, then Mississippi, then down to the Gulf of Mexico, and back out up the Atlantic coast. So the advantages of being able to create that trade route were fairly tremendous. And unfortunately for Mr. Shriver and the backers of the C&O Canal, the railroads beat them to it. And they were faster, easier, better ways to move people and goods in that route, and the canal plan fell by the wayside. But before that was clear, he did a fairly meticulous study of what it would take to get this canal past Cumberland, and did a very detailed map, which we'll see, and it proposed a route that would have essentially flooded, or that would have flooded Deep Creek to build a dam on Deep Creek about where the current dam is, to create a lake that was navigable to allow float the canal boats through that section. But what's fascinating and what's really valuable for what we're looking at is the level of detail that he shows in this area of where they're proposing this canal route would be. So this kind of shows it a weird perspective. The western panhandle of Maryland. At this point, Garrett County was still Allegheny County, and we've got a nice detail of the Deep Creek Valley, let's say, and we'll zoom in here, and I've highlighted some of the features here. So the yellow is the course of Deep Creek, and the roads are in black. Shriver mentions meeting the McHenrys, so this would have been James McHenry at this point, where he was visiting, and he stayed with the McHenrys for a day or so. He mentions the Narrows in his report. And just as a interesting side note, Ingman's Inn Tavern is noted here. There's an interesting side story with a murder on that hopefully I'll do another presentation on down the road. And then another interesting little thing that is only ever mentioned in his book and on this, or his report and in this map, are the falls of Deep Creek. So here is where Deep Creek meets the Youghiogheny River. We've got Swallow Falls here, we've got Muddy Creek Falls here, and apparently a fairly significant waterfall that happened on Deep Creek in this area. So there's some interesting geological thing going on here, but what's interesting is there were a pretty big waterfall that he discusses in his report. So let's jump into a couple snippets of his report. In this first snippet, he describes kind of the area, that main body of the lake, and discusses how it was subject to inundation. He also mentions this remarkable boiling spring that is near the residence of John McHenry, and just due to some interesting geology, it seems to be boiling. That unfortunately was covered up with the lake, and I don't think the pressure behind that is strong enough that you can continue to see anything bubbling up from the surface. But that was an interesting little roadside attraction, maybe, of the early 1800s. And this really interesting and kind of tantalizing description of the falls of Deep Creek. So remember, this is in that area where Deep Creek has kind of gotten into the more rocky canyon type of terrain. And he describes this very large rock that overhangs the falls that makes it look like it's going to fall over onto you at any point, which has given it the name of the Devil's Castle. And I believe this would probably at least the rock would still be um, there. I don't think that the dam was built far enough away from where Deep Creek goes into the Youghiogheny River that there may not be any significant water flow over these rocks anymore. But they may still be there, so there may be some probably trespassing involved to go see these, but I'm just telling you that they're probably still there. Another interesting source that we have in the vein of the hunting expeditions and hunting trips to Garrett County and the Glades is a guy named F.G. Skinner's Reminiscences of an Old Sportsman. So this guy was an interesting character himself. There's a really good article kind of giving his background in a Glade Star article, which is accessible online. And Skinner, visited a Scotsman named Campbell, who was living in the Glades, and you'll see Campbell's name on some of the maps and referenced by some of his contemporaries. And he made some notes regarding the terrain and kind of character of Deep Creek, and had some interesting things to say about the fishing and the meals that were available. So he talks in this first snippet about how Deep Creek, has about 3 to 5 feet in height, and the grassy area that you can hunt duck from. He waxes rhapsodically about a meal that he was served at McHenry's home, and some of the fat, flaky, salmon-colored Deep Creek trout that he's never eaten anything to compare with. So our trout was, legendary back in the time. Moving on to Meshach Browning. So hopefully many viewers are familiar with him, but just in case they are not, he was an author of the book 44 Years of the Life of a Hunter, and they detail many of his hunting tales, but also have fairly rich description of what life in the Glades and what would become Garrett County was like in the early 1800s. He and his wife Mary had several homesteads throughout the area. They would kind of move around from one spot to another. He does mention McHenry and Campbell as his neighbors, multiple miles distant, but they were all kind of neighbors nonetheless. And interestingly, they all kind of reference each other in some of their works. He describes the Glades, and I would definitely recommend a nice reading of this, and reading several of the pieces of it in his book. He does seem to have an eye and appreciation for the natural beauty of the area. And discussing again how good the fishing is in Deep Creek. He, as fast as he could bait his hook and put it in the water, he pulled out the largest kind of trout, 47 of them that he just pulled out of the Deep Creek at the time. And just some other interesting little things, snippets about the area and, the coverage of wildflowers. And the last one is a very interesting tale. Many of his tales are stretched the limits of credulity, but he discussed his practice of spotlighting deer hunting, which is an illegal practice now. What happens is at night, if you flash a light on deer, they just become kind of paralyzed, they freeze, and they make an easy target. So he was spotlighting via canoe along the banks of Deep Creek. And the rest of that story is that there was a deer carcass that had gotten stuck in the mud of the shore of the creek, and a bear jumped into the water, put out Browning's candle. They shot the bear and eventually tracked it down. So very exciting, maybe a little outlandish tale. Jumping now into 1886 is kind of a good map view of what this area was like in 1886. So again, we've got Green. In this one, it's interesting. They don't call it Deep Creek until the confluence of what they called Green Glade Run at the time, which kind of went back this way, and Cherry Creek. So Deep Creek isn't Deep Creek on this map until they meet. But you still see the general things of the main road coming down. You have one road, this bridge crossing of Deep Creek here. What's interesting is kind of looking at what's here in the late 1800s. You've got, McHenry, named as an actual town, and a post office here. You've got a variety of mills. So the S, little stars with S, is a water-driven sawmill. You've got these kind of like along these flowing creeks and streams that have enough flow that they can drive a sawmill. We've got even a steam-driven mill. There's a grist mill in here somewhere right here. Some churches, some schools, but not a lot else. You kind of see up here this Johnstown, which was has kind of faded away as an actual town. Had a good bit of settlement here. This is that area along Sang Run, where Sang Run meets Friendsville Road, Route 42 now. So that had some settlement there. But really along this stretch were just some of the sawmills, maybe some central gathering places, the church and school at this road intersection, but not a lot else in this kind of Deep Creek Valley. And as we said, it was kind of marshy and probably not great for actual building of a long-term house. Things were fairly quiet after Browning's book. There were not a lot of references or discussion about Deep Creek or the Glades area until looking more to the late 1800s, and we have a couple of lakes that get built on Deep Creek. The first was the project of a guy named Gus DeLauder. He was a prominent local citizen, and he became the county's first fish commissioner. In this time, the Maryland's governor and many other officials throughout the country were alarmed at the decline of fishery outputs, Maryland statewide, but throughout the East Coast, fisheries were being overfished and needed, either restocked or preserved. Around 1883, DeLauder and one of John W. Garrett's sons, T. Harrison Garrett, purchased about 1,000 acres right off of Rock Lodge Road, and they constructed a dam on Deep Creek, about where Cherry Creek enters the lake. Enters Deep Creek, and created a lake about a mile long, a quarter mile wide. They stocked the lake with fish. They put grasses on the banks. They had canoes. They even had a miniature steamboat, and they built a fairly significant lodge there, like an 8 or 9 room lodge, and named this lake Lake Cleveland in honor of the President Cleveland's visit to the area, and he actually visited this lake as well. And some snippets on Lake Cleveland. Again, a couple of people visiting. Some stories about visits to Lake Cleveland and how great the fishing and the hunting and the hospitality was there. The snippet in the middle is something, I'm not holding out a lot of hope, but the article from a Republican from 1890, and Mr. John DeLauder, which I'm assuming was the son, exhibited 7 views of Deep Creek and Lake Cleveland, and showing the boat that was there and a bird's eye view of Lake Cleveland. So I imagine these pictures are lost to time, but if anyone has some idea of where they would be, I would love to find them. And then an interesting snippet on the third clipping is that Gus DeLauder built or purchased the old McHenry farm, and he was going to build another lake there because Lake Cleveland was doing so well, and I was not able to find out really anything about why that didn't happen, but it is interesting that the first one was a successful commercial business, that he was looking to build another lake on that would have been on another little tributary of Deep Creek, but like right in that area. The next lake to be built on Deep Creek was by R.T. Browning, grandson of Meshach Browning, and he succeeded DeLauder as fish commissioner. In 1893, he saw the construction of another dam, this one near the site of the Glendale Bridge, and this one formed Lake Brown, named for the governor of Maryland at the time. And again, he stocked Lake Brown with a lot of fish, and what's interesting and important about this one is that this was open to the public. It was built probably as the first publicly funded fishing spot in Maryland, and this is very likely that this was the first time that the state had built constructed a lake for the purpose of encouraging public fishing. It's also interesting to note that DeLauder's Lake was also a lake built solely for recreation. And on this lake, again, there's supposedly a picture of the dam, and there's a road going around near the dam or on top of the dam and a stop sign. So I've heard there's a photo out there on social media, but I've never seen it. I'd love to see this photo as well. But you'll be able to see this on that 1901 topographical map that I showed at the beginning of the presentation. You can see where this lake was. A couple snippets on Lake Brown. Again, the first one's from a visitor who extols the beauty, the bounty of the fishing, and all of the great things of the area. And the little quote at the end is, a desire to not have another tree cut down or put another sawmill or build anything else. So that very common feeling of don't disturb or don't mess up the beauty of the area by doing anything else. That's a very common. Once people get here, they kind of say, okay, we can build my house, but no more. But that feeling goes back to the 1890s and probably even earlier. The middle one is a nice little article about a fish that was caught out of Lake Brown, and I think it is close to the current record. I don't really know exactly what the record is for length, but Getty Browning caught a trout in Lake Brown measuring 17 inches long. So that's a fairly substantial fish. And the third one is a really cool announcement for a dance and picnic that will take place at Lake Brown. So even then, that was, meet at the lake and have fun for a July 4th party. So I thought that was cool. Even back then, that was the place to be. However, so that last snippet was from 1890, and by the early 1900s, the mentions and citations of either Lake Brown or Lake Cleveland really drop off, and I'm not sure what happened then, if the dams got physically removed, they eroded away, or what happened to those. Deep Creek is also rarely mentioned in the newspapers. So most of the references are talking about, whether the county should fund the replacement of the bridge across the creek. In 1912, they finally agreed to, and there was some fanfare about the bridge reopening after being closed and being repaired. But really, this early 1900s, this first kind of 20 years of the early 1900s, seems to be not a lot going on. The Lake Brown and Clevelands were either gone or disused, and when you only start hearing about Deep Creek again in 1922, when there are the first mentions of the current dam project. And just as we get closer to the current day of the lake, you'll see that here they had to relocate some of those roads. So the red circles show roads, the little dotted symbology shows roads that had to be abandoned or will be closed. So that original crossing of Deep Creek here, where they fixed the bridge just 12 years before, that had to be closed and abandoned. So that bridge, you can see on some other imagery, you can see the bridge, the structure is still there. But for instance, this crossing and this little road is just completely gone. They just fully abandoned it. Apparently, very early on the days of the lake, you could see the road still going into the lake bed, but it's either been kind of eroded or removed. And what's interesting here is they have this crossing of Deep Creek slated for closure, but no other proposed, like here they proposed to move the state road here. They don't have any proposed moving or replacement there, so I don't know if the builders of the dam got pressure to replace that bridge or build something new there, or if it just was in the plan, they just didn't put it in here. But some interesting stuff on this map showing how they had to relocate what was there in order to accommodate this new lake. And we'll wrap up kind of the main part of this presentation with my Deep Creek then and now map. So it was shown at the very beginning of the presentation, and it shows that 1901 topographical map overlaid with the outline of the current lake. And you can kind of see, especially more in the southern part of the lake, some of these roads where they just, abandoned the roads. The roads would have kept going across Deep Creek, and they continue on the other side. So it's kind of interesting. You see where the state dam is, that Lake Browning, and some other little interesting pieces of features that kind of got lost when the lake was flooded. And to wrap up, some deep thoughts on Deep Creek. And it was an unusual water body at the time. Most other streams had kind of the wider, shallower course, through forested areas in the hollers of the hills, so to speak. But this Deep Creek was a deep, fairly fast-moving stream, and it had grassy banks. So that combination of the water and the marshy area provided excellent habitat for many species. And then later, to their detriment maybe, good hunting ground for them. So the good fishing, the trout fishing, the waterfowls, the ducks and the geese, and then the bigger game, the bear and the deer that kind of came through that area as well. But even in the 1800s, even the early 1800s, when it was quite inaccessible, the railroad didn't come in until the late 1800s. So people were still having to come in on horse and wagon maybe to get here. They were still coming here, seeking respite from the crowdedness of the city. Came for the hunting probably mainly, but just for the nature, the beauty, the space, and the weather is something that is often mentioned here, in contrast to the humidity and heat and oppressiveness of the cities. Many sources mention how delightful the weather was here. Some other kind of concluding thoughts. It's interesting to note that the two previous dams that were actually built on Deep Creek were solely for recreational use. So today's dam was originally intended for electricity generation, and now I wouldn't say that's a secondary use, but the recreational use has really overshadowed, let's say, the utility use of the dam. And that's an interesting dichotomy of why we built dams and what they've become. And one reminder here is I'm recording this in March of 2024, and Deep Creek Lake will be celebrating its centennial in 2025. And heading up a committee to celebrate that centennial all year in 2025. So we'd love to have you involved. If you've made it this far into the presentation, you at least have some interest in the history of the area. We're going to be collecting and archiving that and thinking about ways to preserve the lake for the next 100 years and beyond. So visit DCL 100, contact me for how you can get involved and get engaged with this big celebration we're having in 2020. As promised, here are all the references and all the places maps and newspaper articles and all of that stuff. With the links were available. And if you are looking to write your own chapter of history, I'm also a real estate agent. I'd love to help you out any of your real estate goals as well. You can contact me. Any of those means there down below, and we can chat about anything. So whether it's real estate, whether you want to talk about Deep Creek Lake, Garrett County history, or anything in between, I'd love to chat and get your perspective. So until then, I'll see you out and about on Deep Creek Lake.